Hey everybody, welcome back to Foreign Post. I'm Steve Susan. So today we're going to take a look at one of the most important elements in international development. So when you think about these projects, you've got a lot of different elements there. You've got the people that do the work, you've got the people that receive or benefit from the work, you've got the governments that are involved in how the work gets done, the restraints, the assistance. There's so much going on there. But one of the biggest aspects of anything in international development is going to be the funding. Billions and billions of dollars go into international development projects, everything from clean water to human trafficking. And you've got so many different groups and donor countries, as well as private companies, private individuals. All of that money flows into what hopefully is getting to help the folks that need it through NGOs, through individuals, lots of different ways to do that, through countries. However, when you talk about these billions and billions of dollars, there's accountability, there's transparency, there's lots of ways that you have to account for the money that's being spent, which also leads to an incredible amount of corruption. Afghanistan suffers from it. So many other developing countries suffer from it. Whether it's governments or the folks on the ground. And it's hard to get all of that together in one place. There's lots of groups that do it. Transparency International is one that follows this. There's, of course, the inspector generals in Iraq and in Afghanistan, Yemen, different places. But it's awfully hard with developing nations if you don't have a banking system, or at least a system that can handle transfers of this sort of magnitude. It's even worse because these are cash transfers. Go back to 2004 in Iraq when the U.S., the Federal Reserve, made a huge withdrawal of cash that went to Iraq. We're talking billions of dollars in $100 bills. And tracing that money was incredibly difficult. And there were accusations and allegations of where the money went. But now it's 2019 and we look at a whole new world and a whole new industry that uses electronic transfers and building that kind of capacity that can make this sort of thing happen. We see it in Afghanistan, where they recently had a trade show, and to transfer money from India, let's say, into Afghanistan, it's hard to do. There's only a certain number of banks that do it, and although that number is growing, it's still very difficult to make that happen. Well, there's one group called Transparency International that we recently sat down with. John Sullivan is one of their directors, and we talked about this. We talked about the future of development and where the money goes, and being able to get a better handle on accountability on this. So I wanted to share with you that interview, and we'll put their website on ForeignPost.com so you can have a better idea of some of the work or some of the organizations that are really looking at funding and how better to do it so the people on the ground, the actual beneficiaries, can get something out of it. So here's our conversation. I have a great guest today. John Sullivan is a former Treasury Department spokesperson and representative. And John and I worked together in Iraq back 05 and 7,
Yep.
Back in the green room of the palace. It's a pleasure having you here. And since those days, you've worked at the Treasury and started working in a specific division with terrorism and
Basically the National Security Division.
Yes, the National Security Division. And how long did you work in that capacity?
About 5 years. As you said, I started off over at Treasury, moving from my time at the State Department, working on really most politics and developments related to the Middle East. That's where I kind of cut my chops on Iran sanctions. And so using my background with Iran sanctions, I moved over to the Treasury Department, National Security spokesman, and we worked on, finance and what it means to the national security of the United States. So that's everything from Iran sanctions, as I said before, on, what we're doing with the North Korean program to put pressure on that, to everything to, drug dealers in South America and, international criminal gangs like the Yakuza in Japan and Brothers Circle in Russia. So it was a really interesting set of issues to focus on.
Incredibly exciting, especially a lot of those that leads actually into your position right now with the Financial Integrity Network.
Absolutely. I mean, the three founders of the Financial Integrity Network, Juan Zarate, Chip Ponce, and Danny Glazer, I had the opportunity to work with Chip and Danny very closely in this division of the Treasury Department, where they were really responsible for crafting U.S. policy for the financial realm as it relates to national security.
So tell me, what does the Financial Integrity Network do?
So it's a multifaceted firm, but the main idea and what drew me to it, especially after my years in government, was how do you take the lessons that you've learned in government and apply them to the private sector and also apply them to the jurisdictions around the world that are trying to improve their counter illicit finance goals? And how does counter illicit finance and the various systems in place to combat fraud, illicit finance, money laundering, how are they looked at from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and how do you kind of create a common framework for understanding these issues?
Well, those are definitely issues that seem to come up every time an IG report comes out.
Absolutely.
And when you think about Iraq and Yemen and Afghanistan, and having been in Afghanistan as long as I have, that the cigar reports, there's always talk about corruption and this sort of thing, not only with government but just with facets of life, with police and even merchants and so forth that are having to make bribes or this sort of thing is just a normal part of business going on, which I know USAID and the Treasury Department folks out there and everything else are trying to make strides in making that happen. But it really boils down to something like in financial inclusion, right? I mean, not just in these war zones, but all over the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting convergence. When you're countering illicit finance, how does that converge with development? And I think looking through it at that lens, one of the main areas is financial inclusion. If people are dealing with cash, especially in these developing areas, projects are funded through cash, it's very opaque. And so what financial inclusion and counter illicit finance have in common is you want more transparency for the system. I think when you have transparency in the financial system, everyone wins. Maybe not the corrupt government official, but I think, the exporters, the traders, the people developing these projects win if they have access to financing, access to transparency, and access to various forms of funding from around the world.
Well, I know that's particularly important in Afghanistan, especially with the Exporter Club. And they recently had their second annual trade show where agriculture was huge, and with dried nuts and fruits and so forth. But a lot of these vendors, when we first started the trade show 2 years ago, they complained about being at the airport. I mean, just at the airport, having to go through layer after layer after layer and bringing the cash to have to bribe those officials and everything else. But now I know they're working on having kind of a corruption-free one-stop shop that would, lend itself to being able to keep their eye on this kind of corruption thing and eliminating that to bring in a lot more credibility and a lot more accountability for buyers in India or wherever else they're going to export these goods, that they know they're actually going to make a profit, and that eventually that goes down to the farmers and everything else with that. But there are other ways of doing that too. There's mobile money, and you're seeing that in a lot of African countries as well.
Yep.
Kenya is one that I saw a 60 Minutes report where it was taxi drivers, and you've got your phone with you, and it seems like cell phones, I mean, is the one communication thing that even in these developing worlds and third worlds, that seems to be a way that you can kind of counter a lot of that that's going on.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great entry for a lot of these traders and maybe people that haven't had bank accounts in the past to directly plugging into the system. So, for example, in Iraq, a lot of people almost skipped the internet age. So they skipped the 90s. Not many people had a personal computer. But by the time we were there in 2005, 2006, everyone had a cell phone.
Sure.
And so, as we're looking at these countries where maybe it's not common that everyone has a bank account, but everyone has a cell phone, and they know they want to pay their bills online. They don't want to have to go down to the post office to pay, monthly bills in cash, which has the possibility of creating a corrupt situation and adding more expenses to their daily lives. The exporters in Afghanistan, they don't want to go having to pay bribes at multiple checkpoints at the airport. They would like to, I would imagine, to use their phone, click it, and say, okay, here's my receipt, my digital receipt. Let me send my goods out and and it realizes a much higher profit margin for them as well.
Well, and that's exactly true with down south in Afghanistan and Helmand province, because you had the Taliban. Once the electricity was up and running and they had the third turbine at Kajaki Dam and everything, the Taliban was actually coming up to people that were getting the electricity and billing them for, like a government agency at the same time that the government was trying to keep their eye on that. And I'll tell you, that's a tricky situation when you get
when your bills are paid in cash, it's always creates opportunity for abuse. So that's really where I think a lot of these people want to get into an online system. And I know paying my bills online makes my life a lot easier.
Yeah, mine too, absolutely. Although it's they slip a few times. So. But one of the things also when we talk about corruption and this sort of thing, when we think about the larger projects, it's not just the farmer in Yemen or in Iraq or in Africa. It's the larger problem of like whole development projects, and you start to get into like Syria and looking at where Syria is going, and some of the banks and financial institutions are. Let's say, reluctant to maybe finance some of these projects and so forth?
I think that's one of the key issues here is finding the balance between countering illicit finance, maintaining your national security goals. For example, USAID. I know it's had issues in the past with some of its projects. Once you go to the subcontractor level, how are you vetting those subcontractors to make sure they're not, involved with Hezbollah or another terrorist group, especially in the case of Syria? So it's finding the balance where these people need these services, they need the access to the financial system, but how do you balance that with protecting their interests and protecting your own interests to make sure that U.S. money, U.S. aid money doesn't go to these terrorist groups, frankly?
Well, and there's been a big problem with that. There's, especially with the new administration and so forth, one of the big questions that came up was, how are these terrorist groups benefiting from these development? And it's not just money. It's, benefiting from the actual projects that are being done. Yeah. You're building schools, you're building hospitals and everything. There's an indirect, I think, that is being part of that too. So walking that fine line is not an easy thing to just, find a solution for.
No, it's about creating the balance. And I think that's where financial inclusion comes in. And back to that, is everyone has the right. I think it's a basic right nowadays to have access to a financial account, to have access to the financial system, just as I think it's a right that all people have access to the internet. It's a very similar, right in our new global age of information and financial inclusion across the world. And so it's important that these people are able to access their accounts in a transparent manner, and hopefully you can see the whole chain of the payments for various aid efforts, for development efforts, so you can see where it starts, who the middlemen are, and where it ends up. And so that last part is really the most important part. Where does it end up? Who does it ultimately benefit? And if the answer is it's a terrorist group or someone else, I think you need to reassess your project and see who is the ultimate beneficiary.
That's right. And there's so many nonprofit groups and NGOs that are out there that deal with transparency and deal with these sort of things. And as we move so much more into these technology things, it's amazing looking at development how far behind some of this development has been. And when we're talking billions of dollars that have gone into these, conflict zones and everything else, that a lot of these things were done with cash, and that, bundles of cash. I remember in Iraq that, there were certain times that, they had suitcases full of cash that, and again, it's that kind of credit. But
they still do in many cases.
They didn't really have the system in the country now. When we think about Iraq now, all these years later, what, from a banking standpoint and, from a centralized in Baghdad, is it better? Is it,
It's a little better. I think the central bank governor and the central bank of Iraq have made strides in the recent years to increase financial inclusion. They're using various projects like having all government employees have to have a bank account. They have to receive their monthly salaries into that bank account. And these banks that are opening the accounts are not just the state-owned banks, which has been an issue for Iraq in the past. They're also including a lot of these commercial private banks that I think are going to be the key to Iraq's financial system in the future. A vibrant private financial sector, I think, can help finance a lot of this development, especially in Western Iraq, which is in such need of it. And having these guys, a corner bank and private banking with online services is an important part of this.
Congress just passed the BUILD Act, the better utilization of investment lending or leading to development. which of course these acronyms, man, I don't know where they come from.
Hey,
These
build,
guys.
it's
You're
catchy.
right. Build. Hey, it's development, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I love it. I think it's a great idea. It certainly is something that I think the administration with China, you're looking at China and the money that they're putting into development. You see it in Ethiopia, you see it in the Gambia, you see it in Pakistan. This, in the articles that I've read, build is really one of those things that I think is like maybe a countermeasure to what China's doing. And how would that fit in with the with what we're talking about with the banks and so forth? That
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's development by investment, which I've seen OPIC and other agencies of the U.S. really have great successes with this in Iraq and elsewhere. And I think when you partner with maybe local financial institutions or when you partner with local investors, that's when these things can become most effective, especially from a U.S. standpoint. Most people would love, entrepreneurs in Iraq or elsewhere would love to have a U.S. partner on the line for their various projects that they want to get done. They don't necessarily want to have a Chinese partner in a lot of these places. They would much rather have U.S. money, U.S. know-how, and U.S. based entrepreneurship to develop these whatever they're working on, whether it's a hotel in Baghdad or a marketplace up north. And I think that's the opportunity for these smaller private commercial banks to expand using these development projects and expand the services that they provide to the population is going to be a really important factor in this.
I think it also adds to credibility with the banks as well. That people feel confident, especially in the country, that they can, that they can bank or trust the banks that are there. So it kind of lends itself to that.
Absolutely. I mean, and especially if it's done in a transparent manner, which I've been hitting on, I think transparency is going to be key on this. So they know how much the bank has invested, what happens to that, what are the payment terms, and see it from a start to finish scenario.
But we're way early with the Build Act right now. And I think there's going to be a lot of questions of how does USAID and where does that relationship come in, especially with priority projects. And USAID is already closing a number of missions and so forth. And, where are those priorities and how does that build, kind of work in with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger that you try to jump in too fast on some of these projects and you don't do the important the vetting that's so important to a lot of these things. So I think especially OPIC, USAID, I mean, they have a pretty well-defined process for choosing projects and then ensuring that their local partners are vetted properly. And so as long as this process doesn't get ahead of that, I think they'll be in good shape.
Talking about vetting and talking about some of these processes and everything else, there are a number of private sector groups or organizations or even companies that are really delving into poverty alleviation, microfinance, this sort of thing. Whole Foods is one with their Whole Planet Foundation. Microfinance is huge for them, and it's all through entrepreneurship, and it's all about being able, the women's empowerment, finding women that want to start their own businesses in Africa and so forth. I think they're in 22 something, so many different countries and this sort of thing. Do you think there's like a trend or maybe something that looks more? I know DFID and USAID are already kind of looking at private sector as taking a lead in a lot of this sort of thing. Do you see that trend, continuing?
I hope so, because I agree. It's a really important trend in the development sphere, and especially where it involves banks and local community banks. One, it allows them to realize a return on their investment a bit quicker than some of these large projects, but it also injects cash into the community. And especially when these microfinance projects involve bank accounts, they involve the aspect of financial inclusion. So the women's company needs to set up a business bank account at the commercial bank, get credit lines for various things that they're investing in. I think that portion of it, as long as it's done in a transparent manner and well regulated by the financial authorities of various countries, it'll go. I think it's an important way to go forward.
And I think the private sector would actually play a bigger role in that, in demanding that, being able to, because of course, they got their company on the line, and this is, their reputation, their brand, and this sort of thing. And they want to, I would think, expand that brand to show the good work that they're doing. So they might even play a role in that accountability as
Absolutely. Private sector is the front line of all of this. Sure, you can have the best regulations in the world, but if the private sector doesn't think they're important or take them seriously, then you're not going to have a well-functioning financial
it starts
system.
to fail at that point. Yeah.
And no one wants to lose their money. They want to ensure that the banks succeed, so they have that guaranteed cash flow, but they also want to make sure that their projects are getting the funding that they need and that it doesn't dry up suddenly because of some illicit actor or some fraudulent activity. So
Sure.
they're doing the vetting on their end for business purposes. And so that vetting should be used by the the regulators and the financial institutions.
See, I'm the same way. I mean, my bank calls me when my my card, somebody's buying stuff at Watkins Glen. That actually happened to me.
Yeah.
Somebody's buying NASCAR stuff on my card and everything else. They shut it off, everything else, and it just so happened I was in Dubai trying to pay my hotel bill, and the card wouldn't work. I was like, oh my god, what am I going to do? So I actually worked at. Luckily, they knew me, and they said, listen, call us when we'll take care of the bill, all that sort
Well,
of
exactly.
thing.
I mean, and I think that's you've experienced firsthand the balance that financial institutions are trying to play here. Yeah, they want to protect you from illicit, from fraud and illicit actions. So they cut off the card immediately when they notice
Right.
illicit activity. But then when you're traveling sometimes and it is really you, they'll also cut off the card. So where do you find the balance in there that you stop the activity, but you're also able to pay for a hotel in Dubai when you
Dude,
travel?
I was freaking out. I mean, I was absolutely terrified. I'm like, I got a plane to catch,
Exactly.
to go back to Afghanistan.
You're trying to call someone in the States at 3 a.m. and
It's Sunday
difficult-
too. There's no
Exactly.
way you're going to do it. It's Sunday, and the way the bank was, and I'm not going to mention the bank, but it was. I mean, they don't even have a Sunday emergency call, and and you're in Dubai.
Yeah, and you're not able to pay for your hotel room. Are they going to keep you there? Is it gonna
Exactly.
be some kind of Ritz situation? I don't know.
Start, fit me up for like a uniform that I can start, parking cars or something to pay that back.
Pay it off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whatever. So Financial Integrity Network, in all that we've talked about moving forward, when you look at the Build Act and you're looking at, moving forward with development projects and this finance, where do you guys see your network kind of playing a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think our main goal is to create common understanding of these issues and to create this balance, as we just said, between combating illicit finance and ensuring that everyone has the access to the financial system as is their right. So we do this probably in two prongs. One, we work with jurisdictions, so countries on their regulations, and how are they working with other, regional bodies. So it's not just each country in a vacuum putting forward regulations.
Right.
And also how are these countries working with their financial sector. So as we said, the private sector is the first line in all of this. They need to have input. They need to have a conversation with their regulators to understand how this balance can be met most effectively. And then we're also working with commercial institutions to say, listen, guys, there's common understandings about how you combat illicit finance, how you create this balance. This institution's spending $1 billion on it. This one's spending $500 million. Why don't you pool resources in a way and kind of try to create this common understanding across the industry, because it'll save people money in the end, and common understanding, I think, will make everything more efficient.
And again, we've been in development. I spent 15 years doing this. Collaboration seems to be one of those things that just seems to be a lost art.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so important.
You bet. And you look at a single topic like, fraud or corruption, or even like food security, anything. You got so many different groups and they're just not working together. But I think, maybe this is something that, especially with FIN and, ForeignPost and some of the other ones that are out there, maybe we can actually bring that
No, I think
together.
that's a great idea for ForeignPost, and how you create these forums for sharing ideas and getting on the same page on issues that affect everyone. Why have each institution or each agency address the changes in the environment, do their own risk assessments on their own, when they could be sharing some of this material and making combined decisions that I think will benefit everyone.
So I think it's a great idea, and I think hopefully we see more of that going forward. So more information for anybody who wants it on FIM. What's your website out there?
It's financialintegritynetwork.net, and you can see all the team there, and as well as we have some pretty interesting policy alerts. So as developments warrant in the field of counter illicit finance, we'll put out pretty short policy alerts that give you the top things to learn and top things to expect coming up.
I love it. And of course, you can reach that through ForeignPost.com. John, as always, it's so great to see you.
Pleasure, brother. Absolutely.
And we'll bring you back here in a couple of months. Maybe we'll see some sort of movement on the Build Act or, some of these other things. And would love to have you back.
Absolutely. So, I think it's a great forum for this type of issue.
That's awesome. Well, thanks, everybody, for being with us. And we look forward to next time here on ForeignPost. Thanks.
Thanks.